to another edition of the DAC Report. This time I'm going to be focusing all my energy at, I wouldn't say debunking, but presenting some objections, or maybe I should call them some corrections to vulgar libertarianism and above all to objectivism. So first problem with objectivism. I thought that libertarian capitalism held promise for making the world better than it would have otherwise been, but I had some problems with it from the beginning. Eventually those problems would become insurmountable. For example, one of the foundational elements of Ayn Rand's philosophy, at least as she was being interpreted by my friends, was that life had intrinsic value. The argument started off by noting that, no matter what one wanted, one needed life in order to pursue it. A corpse could not get a hamburger, or go fishing with his son, or anything. All value depended on life. Therefore, life had intrinsic value. My Randian friends would go from there to derive a right to life, and from here a right to liberty, because it made no sense to say that a person had a right to life but had to spend that life as a slave to others. Following John Locke, they argued further for a right to property, because once a person mixed his labor, his life, with some object that nobody else had a prior claim to, then his right to his own life is transferred to that object, giving him as much of a right to that object as he had to the life that he put into it. Yet, one part of this argument seemed clearly false to me, that no matter what one wants, one has to be alive to get it. One clear example of when this is false is for the person who has an aversion to pain, but whose life is filled to the brim with the most extreme agony. A desire for freedom from pain drives most of us to act, to refrain from moving in ways that cause pain, or to get a pain reliever. This is another way of saying that avoiding pain is a reason for action, a goal that has a particular influence in our decisions. The person who cannot avoid pain does not suddenly care nothing about the pain he is in. He still wants to be rid of it. The statement that freedom from pain is something that is only available to a person who is alive is clearly false. One action one can take to successfully avoid agonizing pain is through death. In this case, death brings the person more of what he wants than life. Another clear example of a desire that, under certain circumstances, gives an agent a reason to prefer death over life is, for example, the father who sacrifices his life to save his children. Similar to this is the case of the soldier facing torture who fears he may give vital information to the enemy. In both of these cases, the agent is better able to realize, make real, what he really cares about through death, rather than through life. When I brought these objections up to one of my friends, he answered that the person seeking freedom from pain must still be alive in order to do something about getting rid of the pain. One has to be alive to give one's life for one's children or one's friends. It's true that the father seeking to save his children must still be alive in order to give his life for them. In addition, the soldier who wishes to keep vital information from the enemy must be alive in order to kill himself to prevent the enemy from getting that information. However, this argument makes no sense. It is like saying that garbage has value because if you want to throw the garbage away, there must first be garbage there to throw away. It is like saying that a job one hates and will quit has value because one cannot quit a hated job that one does not have. The claim that life has value is only meaningful if it means that everything one wants can best be obtained through continuing to live. And that is simply not true.
And you know what I think? Ultimately, the problem goes deeper than this, and understanding the depth of the problem requires that we look at the distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value in more detail. The distinction, by the way, comes from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, though I did not know of Aristotle's writings on the subject at the time. We start by noting that some things have value for the sake of something else. The hammer has value because it is useful in pounding nails to build a sawhorse. A sawhorse has value for holding the lumber that one is cutting to build a house. A house has value because it allows us to keep out the cold, among other things. We can imagine playing a child's game by asking why to every answer we are given. Why does the hammer have value? Why does the sawhorse have value? In each case, we can name something further in which that value is anchored. But inevitably, we will get to an end. Why do we want to be warm? Well, we just do, that's all. Of course, we need to pay attention to the fact that different people are comfortable at different temperatures. And it is still the case that the temperature that suits a person does not have value because of its usefulness. This is not instrumental value anymore. This example of a value train can be represented as follows. Where the value of D provides the engine for the values of A, B, and C. That is to say, the value of everything on the left side of D on the value train is derivative, depending on the value of whatever sits on the far right of the value train. The value of the item on the far right of the value chain is not derivative. To say that something has instrumental value says that it exists on the left side of the chain. To say that something has intrinsic value is to say that it is the item at the right end of the chain, that it has value for its own sake. Now, is this true? I need to make a quick statement about terminology that is going to become important later on. I have problems with using the term intrinsic value for whatever engine drives any particular value train. Intrinsic value is commonly taken to mean more than being the engine for a value train. It is often taken to mean being at the end of the value train in virtue of its intrinsic properties. This is why it is called intrinsic value. I do not think intrinsic value in this sense exists, so I am reluctant to use the word.
For the time being, I will stick to the traditional usage. However, eventually I will argue against the existence of intrinsic value in the sense of value in virtue of its intrinsic properties. Yet, I will not argue against the existence of various engines for pulling the various value trains. The ancient Greeks made the same kind of mistake when they called the smallest pieces of an element an atom, which literally meant having no parts. Well, I will argue later that value engines, do not have intrinsic value. For now, I'll just use intrinsic value to mean existing as the engine for some value train, and leave off any assumptions as to why or how it is there. I also want to make it clear that the same object can have both instrumental value and intrinsic value at the same time. For example, an individual may be interested in a piece of art both for its aesthetic beauty, value as an end, and because owning it will help him impress the people he wants to impress, value as a means. In fact, I cannot think of a value train where the engine is something that is always and entirely nothing but something valued as an end, something that is not at the same time useful for something else. Certainly, it would be more difficult for me to focus on writing this book if I was not in a room that was at a comfortable temperature. Yet, even if I was not writing this book, I would rather be comfortable than freezing. This level of comfort remains something that I value in part for its own sake, even if not exclusively for its own sake. And now back to the libertarian argument. The libertarian argument states that because life is useful for whatever else one may desire, which, as I have already explained, is false, life has intrinsic value. However, once we understand the difference between value as a means and value as an end, we see that the argument confuses distinction. In effect, the argument for the special value of life, or survival, is we see that whatever has value as an end in a person's life, it is something that one must be alive in order to obtain. That is to say, whatever value chain or value engine a person may have, whatever plays the role of D in the above example, I am alive is always somewhere in the list of items to the left of it. Because being alive has a value as means in many, or even all, value trains, reason dictates treating being alive as the ultimate value as an end. The conclusion does not in fact follow from the premises. Being a nearly universal value as a means does not imply being a value as an end. Money is also something that has nearly universal value as means, yet it is not inconsistent to hold that its value continues to reside in nothing more than its usefulness. It is not something to value for its own sake. I hope you enjoyed this first objection. Send me your comments. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And I'll see you in the next clip.